great princes, emperors and kings, dukes and marquises, counts, knights, and burgesses, and people of all degrees who desire to get knowledge of the various races of mankind and of the diversities of the sundry regions of the world, take this book and cause it to be read to you. This is the formulaic beginning of a romance, and it is a formula found in Marco Polo's travels, which we'll look at in a minute. Today's book discussion is about the Chan's Great Continent, China in Western Minds, by the China scholar Jonathan Spence. The most important thing here is China in the Western Minds. So this book is not about China, it's about our, if I include myself in the West, whatever that is, imaginings of China. We have 12 chapters: the worlds of Marco Polo, the Catholic century, the realist voyages, deliberate fictions, matterns of enlightenment, women observers, China at home, the French exotic, an American exotic, radical visions, mystiques of power, and genius at play. How often do we pick up a history of, say, Native Americans or Africa or something of that nature, and the very first chapter has the whites walking in and ignores all of the history before that? This is the only book where I allow it to begin with Marco Polo. Because why? Because it is about China in the Western mind. I'm going to take you through a couple paragraphs from the introduction where they talk about their intentions for the chapter, and add a few notes that I took from each of the chapters in turn. We're going to begin, of course, with Polo, Il Milioni. He was called the Million, Marco Million, because he had a million, let's say, tails, to be generous, not to say lies. Whatever Marco Polo the construct is that gives this version of China, whether it's, the son and nephew of the Polos and their travels in the East, or more of a confabulation with the scribe Rustichello, from whom we probably derived those romance formulas that was very likely that Marco Polo in prison, I think, would have been spouting at Rustichello. They probably had access to the ideas of Aldine, the Nestorians in China, could have been sitting on the Black Sea, gathering tales. It's not that important. The image that I most like of a real little boy Polo is the Khan's favor for him, because the Khan is quite curious about the world. And in fact, I think Kublai was the Khan who had all the religious scholars come, right, to try to convince him what religion he should be. Anyway, but his reporters, the people that he would send out to the field, always just gave him sort of the facts and figures. So what he liked about Marco was Marco would tell him the tales, give him the gossip, spill the tea. One of the big readers of Polo, to show you the extent of the influence, was Christopher Columbus. So this is what the introduction begins by saying. The legacy of Polo lay to some extent in the data that he provided, but even more in the curiosity he aroused. The development of printing in the West in the 15th century brought published versions of his earlier manuscripts into readers' hands by the 1480s, and it was one of these early editions that was read and annotated by Columbus. By the 1540s, the spillover from Columbus' discoveries had brought the Portuguese to Macau, the Spanish to the Philippines, inaugurating what can be fittingly called the Catholic century of China sightings. So now we're into Chapter 2, the Catholics chapter. The reports, polemical tracts, and novels written at that time, we'll look at 5 examples, rooted China with a totally new level of specificity into Western minds and introduced strong currents of emotion into what was becoming a heated European debate over the nature of China's people and uses to which one might put this information. So some interesting things from the Catholics. You've got Ricci, right, inventing terms for God to try to get away from Shangdi, this Chinese sort of mythological figure, came up with the term, what was it, Tianzhu. Tian is heaven, Lord of heaven, something like that, which is actually a pagan term. And the funny thing is that when these Westerners invent these Chinese terms, and then later on other Westerners discover them and say, look, the Chinese have this term for God, Shang Tianzhu, not realizing it was invented by this missionary, Ricci. One of the pernicious ideas that one encounters with China is that they have a no religion. Despite massive ancestral rites, I mean, Confucius is obsessed with rites. You still find this, by the way, in some people's views of Buddhism today, trying to always say, oh, Buddhism's not a religion. They want to adapt it as a philosophy, which is fine, but you can't argue that it's not a religion in the way that it's expressed by its native practitioners in most cases. Right. So now, as the 17th century waned, and with it the peak of the Catholic nation's program of overseas conquest and expansion, the naval powers of the emerging Protestant states were ready to seize opportunities this offered. Diplomats and soldiers from Netherlands, Great Britain, became the next group to explore China, and these men saw themselves as realists with certain tasks to perform. They viewed with a new kind of hostility China's attempts to force them to accept traditional forms of ritualized subservience, especially the kowtow, involving a series of 9 protestations before the figure of the emperor, or even before symbols of his authority in his absence. The British, who saw in such ritual observance an abandonment of national dignity rather than convention of international relations, were inevitably headed for confrontation. Such a passage can be traced through 3 of the sightings left to us across the century by Bell, Anson, and Lord McCarthy. Right, yeah, so you'll get these Buddhist practitioners in the West also don't like to bow. So instead of just saying, oh, this is just a court etiquette, like you would do, in honor of the King of Portugal if you go to visit the King of Portugal, they didn't want to adopt the forms of address towards the Chinese emperor. So in this chapter 3 now we have the pigeon problem. So up till now you've got people Chinese people speaking to Westerners in French, in Latin, but as the Chinese begin to learn a little bit of English and try to adapt to the English who refuse to learn other languages, inevitably some of their English is not perfect. And now this leads to a temptation to have Chinese people speak in a sort of pidgin, which makes them sound, ineloquent, to say the least. When in fact they speak their Chinese, of course, perfectly, and indeed speak another language in English, and probably other languages as well. Curiosity, yeah. Here's an interesting quote from this chapter, the realist chapter, about curiosity. This could be arguably cultural misunderstanding at any time in any encounter between two cultures, and indeed could just be a problem of intersubjectivity if you want to get phenomenological about it. But I think it's really fun and interesting to look at. So here we have McCartney is the person here. He discovered that his genuine curiosity about Chinese life and social customs, far from being appreciated, had led the Chinese to suspect him of dangerous designs. He was conscious at all times of being very narrowly watched, and all our customs, habits, and proceedings, even of the most trivial nature, observed with an inquisitiveness and jealousy which surpassed all that he had read of in the history of China. So on the one hand, he's made uncomfortable by the gaze of the Chinese upon him, but he's also upset that the Chinese are suspicious of his gaze upon them. It's sort of a goose and gander kind of situation there, which I find, in this current era, in this incredibly dangerous, doctrine of cultural appropriation, where people are really afraid to be curious about others because, they might not get it perfect and someone's going to condemn them or something like that. I think it's very dangerous. All right, so moving on to the next chapter. It is an assumption of mine that the impact of China need have little or anything to do with the literalness or precision of an actual experience. Thus, I follow the diplomats who would have claimed to be realists with their contemporaries who stayed away from China, content to transpose it into fiction. So this is the chinoiserie chapter, the deliberate fiction. Here we've got, Defoe, and he's imagining sort of every Mandarin with their 50 maidens, sort of echo of the 14th century John Mandeville stuff. You've got Goldsmith in his Citizen of the World being tutored. Ah, yeah. Even when the Chinese are sort of included in the tutored nations, it's an interesting. Here, tell me what you think of this. Truth is, Chinese and we are pretty much alike. Different degrees of refinement, not of distance, mark the distinctions among mankind. Savages of the most opposite climates have all but one character of improvidence and rapacity. Tutored nations, which he includes China, however separate, make use of the very same methods to procure refined enjoyment. I have no idea what his qualifications or indeed his criteria for including tutored or savage or categorizing tutored or savage nations are, but I go on. The distinctions of polite nations are few. Such as are peculiar to the Chinese appear in every page of the following correspondence. The metaphors and allusions are all drawn from the East. Their formality our author carefully preserves. Many of their favorite tenets and morals are illustrated. The Chinese are always concise, so is he. Simple, so is he. The Chinese are grave and sententious, so is he. But in one particular, the resemblance is peculiarly striking. The Chinese are often dull, and so is he. Ouch. Okay, so are the Chinese always concise? Certainly some of their poetry can be, but they can also be quite hyperbolic. If you read a menu, you have dishes described as, the gentle flowing of the autumn wind soup or something of that nature. So let's jump to chapter 5, I think it is. So in yet a third reprise of the course of the 18th century, we can see how powerful synthetic minds were also drawn to China they had never seen. So now we're getting into the Enlightenment chapter, right? Goldsmith had his fictional Chinese narratives and wondrously observed that the English were trying to reason him out of his own country. Leibniz, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Herder can perhaps be charged with doing that, as each of them made his own cut into the available historical records in an attempt to create a system in which the totality of China, as they understood it, could be inserted, though at least the first three writers corresponded, conferred with those who did know China at first hand. Those first three being Leibniz, Montesquieu, and Voltaire, not including Herder. So to keep in mind what's going on at this time historically, Louis XIV is about to revoke the Edict of Nantes in 1685, and in 1692 China is promulgating an edict of religious tolerance. So sort of moving in opposite directions there. You've got Voltaire's play, The Orphelin de la Chine, the Chinese Orphan, or sometimes called Orphan of Zhao. this is a bit interesting. Here we begin to have a realization of sort of the diversity within culture. One of the signs that I look for when someone's telling me about a culture is if they speak of it only monolithically, even a more homogeneous, perhaps, culture like China. I worry, and they don't make any distinctions between divisions within, say, Chineseness or Japaneseness or whatever it is. So here, Voltaire is really looking at the Manchu-Han sort of conflict. So that I thought was a sort of interesting thing that popped up in that era. Okay, moving on to the Romantic. Poets of the Romantic movement clearly offer one convenient bridge for moving from the revolutionary epic that climaxed the period of Enlightenment into different world in the 19th century. But Jane Austen forms another bridge, marking the emergence of women as makers of China sightings. Though it's only a premonitory flash, her use of Lord Macartney's journal in her novel Mansfield Park and the lived experiences of her brother Frank in Canton prepares for the new generation of Western women who made more personal and protracted China sightings in the 19th century. Many of the women were Americans, who thus brought twin new perspectives of gender and nation to the China scene, as we move from Eliza Bridgman at the century's beginning to Jane Edkins in its middle, and on to Sarah Conger and Eva Price at the end. And through their eyes we see the charm of China tinged with deep dangers, with the Boxer Uprising in the 1900s serving as the fitting code of their experiences. So yeah, Frank Austen, he was in China on a naval expedition. In fact, he was very frustrated there by the same sorts of delays that I discussed in my previous China history video about the Mongkut, King Mongkut, I think was the title of the book, something like that. Here you can really see culture shock happening in some of these writers. So there's one of the women writers just enthralled, right, in the honeymoon stage, saying she wanted to write that China is beautiful on the bottom of every page, but quickly succumbs to sort of the shock of the crowds, for example. She's quite fearful of the crowds, understandably so, and sort of turns her opinion on China. One thing you, of course, have men noticing things like bound feet and things of that nature, but there are certain things that weren't really noticed before the women observers. I'm not sure when commenting on female infanticide began, but it's certainly noticed in these chapters. Another thing that I'll say is, perhaps not in this era so much, but in current eras, a female regard on foreign cultures can be really helpful with these sorts of issues. I think of female genital mutilation in West Africa, and where people are really confused about the participation of, many times it's done by women, to women. So confused by the women's participation in foot binding, female infanticide, things of that nature. It's really helpful for a woman to be able to interrogate that, not taking away that these things definitely, of course, have the patriarchal causes and influences, but that the female participation in the phenomena can be really interestingly looked at by women. Sorry, it's an aside there that got a little out of hand. All right, let's get back to China in the mid-19th century. So for the first time, Chinese laborers began to travel to the United States in search of work. So now for the first time, we have Chinese people not, of course, there had been Chinese travelers in the West throughout all this time. But in this book, this is our first chapter of but anyway, you have a lot of Chinese going to America to build the railroad, right? Transcontinental Railroad from the western side across. One of the things that would happen was very sad is they would get paid, so we suddenly have a bunch of money at the end, and they're out of work, obviously, and they've got to go find somewhere else to be. So they're traveling, they've got all this money, and they were just fodder for robbery. So many of them got robbed. And one of the big problems, which we're going to see in Twain's epistolary work here, the letters of Song He, where he gets attacked and beaten, the Chinese were not allowed to testify. They had literally no voice in courts. So difficult, obviously, to get justice. Okay, now to the French exoticism. So the French at the same time had been distilling the experiences in collective China sightings of 2 centuries into a fairly coherent type of vision, which I term a new exotic, one compounded of violence, allure, and nostalgia. The 3 writers, Loti, Claudel, and Ségalin, all lived in China for periods of time between 1895 and 1915, and believed they had caught its true sight, sounds, and smells. As writers of considerable power, they enlarged Western literary vocabulary, even as they restricted the full play of Chinese personality in their own imaginative renderings. So you got Loti is an interesting one. Now he was in China for 14 years, so I think you begin to get a feeling that he had a certain intuition towards China. And of course, when he talks about things like sort of the opium phenomena, you also have to, I hope now people are knowing historically the context of the British role in creating the opium problem in China. Right, so Pierre Loti, he wrote these titles like, what's the Annamese one? He wrote one for Japan with something in chrysanthemums, Madame Chrysanthemum. Wrote one in Tahiti, The Marriage of Loti. One Turkish one, Ziyade. And then the Chinese one is The Last Days of Peking. So you can see a real interest in exoticism there. And the part I wanted to share is the anthill section. I think that was him with the anthill. Je passe, and I carry the memory of a life congested, naive, restless, of a city of the same type, open and crowded, a single house with a multifold family. I'd seen the city of other days when, free of modern influences, men swarmed in an artless disorder. In fact, it is the fascination of all the past that I'm leaving. When, issuing out of the double gate of the hurly-burly of wheelbarrows and litters, in the midst of lepers and epileptics, I see the electric lights of the concession shine. The actual word anthill appears elsewhere in that section, but at first I found that metaphor sort of kind of apt to people who've had an experience of a Chinese city, or indeed of many Asian cities, many third world cities, arguably all mega cities, of the sort of crowdedness and busyness and that sort of thing. But then I was thinking that this is sort of a modern phenomena of modern travel, which takes one, first by steamer boats and then later by plane, principally into these large cities, right? As opposed to earlier travelers who went through the countryside and obviously would have had a different, a more rural experience of that sort of thing. At the same time, I found something, some true, something in that was really felt true to my experience in China, for whatever it's worth. And I don't speak Chinese super well, and of course, I've only lived there 3 times. But right, so that's the French exotic. Now, what about the American exotic? Having identified, perhaps overconfidently, what seems to be a French exotic, I moved to the question of whether some kind of American China exotic was also in formation, replacing the crudities of Chinatown characterizations with something at least partly rooted within China and Chinese culture. A film like Griffith's Broken Blossoms perpetuated a new view of China. And he goes on to talk about some films, Pearl Buck. You've got, what else have we got in here? O'Neill will talk about some polemics, find a natural home in politics, though that's moving into chapter 10. So what shall we say about the American exotic? Well, you've got Ezra Pound. He's sort of got his imagistic China, which is always trapped in the Tang Dynasty. China is often the victim of this, that it's got this amazing long history. It's existed almost in that name for so long that people often talk about China in terms of essentialized pasts and don't allow it to evolve and exist in its contemporary forms and things of that nature. So that's a problem. You can definitely see that, I think, in Pound's poetry there. You've got his translation of the Analects, in which there's the Analect where they're asking Confucius who is right, and the four people give an answer, and Confucius says something like at the end, like they're all right, for each answered according to their nature. Whereas in Pound's translation of it, at the end he says Tian is right. I forget which one. He just basically picks sides with one of the speakers that he liked best. So some really, shall we say, creative translation going on there. Of course, we know about Pound's use of illusion. You got Dr. Lau. This was interesting. Finnegan, what is the author's name again? This is one I haven't read. There are a couple in here that I haven't read. So here we got Finney. Finney's Dr. Lau. I thought this was interesting. This is the circus of Dr. Lau. We show you things that you don't know. We tell you places you'll never go. We've searched the world both high and low to capture the beasts from this marvelous show. From mountains where madden words did blow, to islands where zephyrs breathed sweet and slow. Oh, we're spared no pains, and we're spared no dough, and we're dug at the secrets of long ago. And we've risen to heaven and plunged below, for we wanted to make it one hell of a show, and the things you'll see in your brains will glow, long past the time when the winter snow has frozen the summer's fur below. But for this is the circus of Dr. Lau, and youth may come and age may go, but we have more circuses like this show. So you can definitely see a very strong exoticism there, right? Equating sort of China as a sort of circus full of, I guess, freaks and, marvels. But I think it spans, if we think of Fu Manchu, sort of the enemy, right? The archetypal enemy, you can even see in the Star Wars prequel movies. You can see that on the one end. But you can also see sort of Inspector Wang, right? He's the hero solving the... Now, of course, he was played by Western actors with horrible makeup, but he's he's the hero solving the crime. But in Chinatown, right, for the most part, not outside. So strong American exoticism there. I would agree with that. So moving on to our 10th chapter, polemics, find in natural Roman politics. And there's certainly residue of Western rhetoric that could be applied to what we're seeing as new political forces emanating from China after the revolution. So we got our revolutionaries here. Let's start with Malraux, Andre Malraux. Andre Malraux wrote the Voix Royale, which I think rivals Heart of Darkness, if you don't know. He was the Minister of Culture for France, sort of in the 60s, friends of, Roland Barthes and all these big thinkers. But he was a thief, an antiquities thief in Cambodia, and he'd never even been to China. So his whole work, Man's Fate is how it's translated in English, La Condition Humaine, is, or Universelle, I don't remember, is about this Chinese revolution, but he'd never even been to China. So let's move on from that. Let's talk about Brecht. So Brecht, one interesting thing that Brecht does in, what's the name of the play? Measures Taken. Brecht takes us north to Mukden. So a lot of the Chinese regard being urban is also very southern. So, down in Hong Kong, down in Shanghai, which, we call southern. Chinese, it's, anyway. But so he takes it north. So he's expanding our vision of China. And his view on the communist stuff in China is quite interesting. Let's take a look here. Short passage, and we're near the end here. He who fights for communism must be able to fight and not fight, must tell the truth and not tell the truth, render service and not render service, place himself in danger and avoid danger, be recognizable and be unrecognizable. He who fights for communism has, of all virtues, only one, that he fights for communism. Now that will lead you with a certain, perhaps leave you, or at least it left me, with a certain kind of harsh view of communism as sort of, you could even accuse it of newspeak, but at worst it's sort of being a difficult path, right, to do two things at once. And some of those things are obviously on the negative end. But I do feel there's a sympathy there as well. I read it in this passage, for instance. They know that misfortune doesn't grow on the breast like leprosy, that poverty doesn't fall like tiles from the roof, but that misfortune and poverty are the work of man. Want is cooked in the pots on their stoves, and misery is their only food. Right? So we grow enough food to feed all the people. It's a distribution problem. Okay, I'm not going to get into my views, but I do see some sympathy there, I think, with the sort of communist project in China. We won't say more about that. Then we're going to keep it literary here for the most part. And 11 is the mystique of the ruler's power in China that has dominated Western sightings ever since Poe's depiction of mighty Kublai in the 1270s. During the late 19th century period of China's weakness, in the 40 years that followed the collapse of the last dynasty in 1911, such a vision of centralized power had yielded place to one of localized violence and implicit threat. So one of the problems is, right, the socialist project does sort of subsume literature and always wants to make it didactic, and therefore, sort of like a lot of literary crit, especially theory today, it's all politics. Whereas I want to pull it back, and I feel Jonathan Spence might sympathize with me, always to the more humanistic side of the literary regard on things. Because these are, after all, metaphors, right? These are, we're trying to understand something and talk about it, right? And explain it through words. So, Whit Fogel is one of the authors talked about here, not read, The Oriental Despotism. Now, before you get upset at the use of the word Oriental here, fear not. Way before that became problematic, he already was trying to find other words. And the one he settled on was hydraulic. Please do not ask me to explain to you what hydraulic despotism is as it is expressed in China. In fact, I don't have much to say about this chapter at all. So I'll, use this opportunity to look at the O'Neill scene that I wanted to bring back, Marco Million. So Eugene O'Neill, our playwright, Nobel laureate from the States, wrote this play, Marco Millions. It's great. He's got this scene quite the opposite of the kid Marco delighting Kublai with his stories of his travels. And this scene, Kublai is not pleased with him. The Khan replies, "He is beginning to weary me," speaking of Marco. "He's beginning to weary me with his grotesque antics. A jester inspires mirth only so long as his deformity does not revolt one. Marco's spiritual hump begins to disgust me. He has not even a mortal soul. He has only an acquisitive instinct. We have given him every opportunity to learn. He has memorized everything and learned nothing. He has looked at everything and seen nothing. He has lusted for everything and loved nothing. He is only a shrewd and crafty greed. I shall send him home to his native wallow." Before you cry too much for little Marco, here comes the granddaughter, Kukachin, to the rescue. She's, of course, in love with Marco. "Why are you both so unjust? Has he not done well everything he has ever appointed to do? He was ever appointed to do. Has he not always succeeded where others failed? Has he not, by his willpower and determination, risen to the highest rank in your service? He is strange, perhaps, to people who do not understand him, but that is because he is so different from other men, so much stronger, and he has a soul. I know he has." Okay, so this I love because we started with whether the Chinese get a soul, or at least whether they have religion, and we come full circle to the end to wondering if Marco or the Westerners have a soul. lusting after everything and loving nothing. There is one more chapter, however, to discuss. The book ends with the China sightings made by 3 20th century writers of acknowledged genius, even though they never set foot in the country at all. You've got Kafka's The Chinese Wall, where the master keeps kicking over the wall, the kid's building. This actually is an echo of a old Tibetan story. Is it Milarepa? There's a Tibetan student who a master has built a tower that he knocks over every year for, I don't know, decades, until he will accept him as a teacher as soon as he stops caring about completing the tower. I don't think Kafka gets there in the end, but it's a nice sort of Kafka situation. You got Borges, right? The Garden of Forking Paths. This, let's see if I can remember this one. The narrator's uncle is writing a novel that he wants to be even more populous than Hong Lumeng. Hong Lumeng is Red Chamber, the story of the stone, which, if you've never read one of the Chinese classic novel, it's populous, a lot of characters. And then the end with Italo Calvino, the ineffable Italo Calvino. So that's it. I think this has been a really useful book, full of, I think, penetrating insights. I agreed with most of them. Jonathan Spence, Chan's Great Continent, China in the Western Mind. This is a Penguin book, and it came out in 1998. So maybe there's an upcoming edition coming with a new chapter. That would be great. Jonathan Spence, if you hear this, give us another chapter. We love it. We love what you give us. All right, folks, any questions, comments, praise, down in the comments. That would be awesome. If you liked it, share it with some people. Really help. If you want to subscribe, that's awesome too. We often look at different cultural literature stuff. So, cheerio.